Has there ever been a character that's had so little screen time and yet such longevity as a character? Do you guys realize that Void has officially only appeared 4 times across the entire manga? And the third appearance wasn't even a full appearance, it was just his brain glowing and pulsing as the great roar of the astral world washed over the physical world. And yet, if you take even the most marginal anime/manga fan and show them a picture of Void, there's a decent chance they'll recognize him as that guy from Berserk. So, what is it that makes Void such a cultural mainstay? And what does he actually do in the series? Well, today we'll be taking a look at all that and more in this video. This is Void's complete character explained. He's more than just the pinhead of this gash. The Godhand versus the Cenobites. One of the clearest homages in Berserk is the Godhand, because their entire composition and purpose is practically the same as that of the Cenobites from Hellraiser. Hellraiser, as you might already know, is one of the most iconic horror franchises of all time, with occultism at the heart of its narrative. In it, a man finds an object called the Lament Configuration, which is a kind of mystical Rubik's Cube that, when solved, gives you access to otherworldly pleasures. The trade-off? You become a part of hell forever. When you solve the Lament Configuration, 4 figures that look like a cross between a human and a demon show up in front of you and explain to you that they can give you access to sensations that you've never felt before. But in exchange, your soul will be forever pledged to hell, and you yourself will be pulled into it should you accept. The first Hellraiser movie basically showed us the consequences of breaking this deal because its main antagonist somehow managed to resist the demon people, and the climax of the film is him being dragged back into hell as part of his penance. He paid the price, but he refused to serve the time, so he was made to do so after a series of grotesque and uncomfortable events. If you guys haven't caught on yet, that's basically how a Behelit functions, minus the jigsaw puzzle aspect of it. I mean, you could even say that Behelits can only be used when a person solves the puzzle within their hearts and decides that power and perversion is what they truly prefer in life, and that wouldn't be inaccurate, bringing this particular object even closer to being a Lament Configuration. Plus, there's the way it spins around and rearranges itself. The Cenobites themselves were servants of the god of hell, Leviathan, but at one point in their lives, they were human beings. This was revealed in future installments of the series, and we even see the leader of the original Cenobite gash, Pinhead, sort of rebel against his master to safeguard the humanity that he'd lost to hubris. He and his 3 companions were all people tempted by the Lament Configuration, and at various points in the franchise, most Cenobites have at least attempted to break their oath to hell or been burned by it. But that's as far as the similarities between the Godhand and the Cenobites go, because unlike the Cenobites, the Godhand doesn't sling pain and pleasure. The Cenobites are a form of commentary on the human pursuit of depravity. They embody everything that's wrong with this world, and they're not shy about it. In fact, they relish it. And they just want like-minded individuals to join them no matter the cost. As the movie series progressed, many Cenobites quote-unquote recovered their human memories and tried to stop spreading the madness that they'd unleashed upon the world. But the Godhand doesn't feel like a group of S&M cosplayers who just want people to have as good of a time as they're having, no matter how twisted their definition of a good time is. They're ethereal beings whose true purpose is obscured from even those who serve them, because they never explicitly state their purpose. You know that they're demonic in nature and that they want to spread evil throughout the world, but they aren't tempting people into becoming sadomasochists. They're doing what they think is right, which is bringing humans closer to what they perceive as their true natural state of existence. In Hellraiser, Hell and Leviathan have existed presumably for eons, but the Godhand only came into existence because of humanity. Miura framed his magical systems and other dimensions off the concept of collective consciousness, and that means that even though the Godhand, like the Cenobites, were all human at one point in time, they're more than mere emissaries of hell. They're a part of its fabric, and it's a part of them, which is proven when Femto summons the Vortex of Souls when he's trying to convince the Slug Count to go through with sacrificing his daughter. That's another thing that's different about the Cenobites and the Godhand, because to complete the Lament Configuration ritual, you don't need to sacrifice anyone besides yourself, whereas when you use a Behelit, additional sacrifices are required. You also don't need to go out into the world and find a Behelit, because if you're destined to use it, it will find its way to you regardless of what you do. The concept of fate is deeply intertwined with the Godhand's existence in a way that just isn't present in Hellraiser, which makes the potential death of a Godhand a lot more consequential than a Cenobites. Cenobites are replaceable. That's the biggest thing that people need to keep in mind about them. Several people become Cenobites across the entire Hellraiser franchise with little to no change in the inner workings of Hell or their own motives. The Godhand is a part of the fabric of the very concept of evil, so rather than being perverse pleasure peddlers, they're divine figures who literally transform the lives of those they choose to appear in front of. The Godhand offers a deal to the people who find and activate their Behelites, much like the Cenobites offer deals to those who solve the Lament configuration, but they don't add new members to their own ranks. A new Godhand member can only be created by using the Crimson Behelite, which appears on Earth once every 216 years. Usually, they're summoned by people who use regular Behelites, and these people don't become members of the Godhand after their assigned rituals are completed. Instead, they become apostles, lesser demons who are still very powerful, but who exist on a much lower rung than the Godhand on the totem pole of evil. That's one of the biggest differences between these two groups of demons. Well, that, and the fact that the Godhand has an additional member. The original Cenobites were this iconic quarter comprised of Chatterer, Butterball, the female Cenobite, and of course, Pinhead. The Godhand has equivalents to each of them, plus a fifth member who's Falcon-themed, named Femto. If you just go off of what happens in the Black Swordsman arc on a superficial level, you'd be forgiven for mistaking Femto as the leader of the group. After all, he takes on much of the role of Pinhead from the movies, as he's the one who leads the Godhand's conversion conversation. Butterball is clearly Conrad, Chatterer is Ubik, and Miura gave his female Cenobite a name, Slan, to differentiate her from her inspiration. But if you read that same arc carefully, you'll realize that Void is the true Pinhead of this gash, not just because of his character design, but also because of his actions. Well, it's true that Femto is the one who summons the Vortex of Souls that's Berserk's equivalent of Hell. The rest of the Godhands seem to follow Void's lead in everything. Femto is the spunky upstart newbie, which we find out soon enough because the entire Golden Age arc was all about how he ascends to become a Godhand. So, how did Void become Pinhead? How did he come to lead this single group of demonic heralds who have ushered hundreds, if not thousands of people into the ranks of demonkind without solving an annoying Rubik's Cube? Well, now that we've explained the main differences between the Cenobites and the Godhand, let's get into the actual character we're here to talk about, Void himself. He used to be close to an ancient king until he wasn't. How Void became Void. Perhaps the biggest difference between the Godhand and the Cenobites is the fact that their human lives have a massive influence on their time as a demonic angel. Apostles are created through sacrifice. The formula is you get assigned a Behelite, then you reach a point of despair so deep that your only desire in life is to change your circumstances, then your blood communes with the Behelite to summon the Godhand, at which point they offer you immense power and a life without conditions on one condition. You must give up the person/people that define your life as a human being. This number can be as low as 1 or as high as 3, but the main idea is that the owner of the Behelite suffers through no immediate side effects. It's always the people that they love the most who go through it, and apostles are low-tier demons to say the least. They might have obtained inhuman power, but they don't become entirely inhuman themselves. They remain tethered to the physical world, and their sense of morality devolves to the point that they seem like real monsters, but they're still pretty much flesh and blood and can be killed. Once they die, their souls take a one-way trip to the Vortex, because that's the deal all apostles make. In exchange for eternally pledging their souls to hell, they receive immense strength and the authority to do whatever they want, and when someone actually manages to kill them, they have to hold up their end of the bargain. We see this happening in the first arc of Berserk, where the Slug Count's soul is pulled out of his body and literally dragged to hell after he rejects the Godhand's offer, which means that they also lose the ability to physically alter the world. The Godhand is a purely metaphysical organization because it exists solely within the Astral World, completely detached from all things human and material on a fundamental level. In order to reach this level of existence, the sacrifice required is immense and deeply personal in a way that transcends simple humanity. For example, the Slug Count, who we've mentioned a few times already, became an apostle by sacrificing his wife, whom he loved very much. Now, that's a perfectly acceptable sacrifice for an apostle because most apostles are required to sacrifice people that they care about and who care about them in return, at least for the most part. To become a Godhand, however, you need to sacrifice people who form a core part of your identity, and we don't mean in a till death do us part kind of way. We mean that your entire sense of self, whether you recognize it or not, hinges upon the success and failure of a large group of followers who see you as half a god for all the amazing things you can do. Griffith never consciously classified the Band of the Falcon as his friends because his definition of a friend was someone who was his equal, but he did tie his identity and his first ever important dream to the Falcons, because without them, he, Griffith, couldn't achieve the dream that he's had ever since he was a little kid, and that's to be king of the whole damn world. For as long as he could remember, Griffith had wanted to be a king, and to become a king, the most important step is to have an army that's highly disciplined, highly effective, and highly loyal to you. So, even though Griffith never consciously attached his self-worth to his warband, he knew that they were perhaps the most integral part of his identity. Without them, he loses the entire foundation upon which he wanted to build his kingdom, so to sacrifice them would be akin to sacrificing his own dreams, which is something he'd never do in a million years. Of course, he ends up doing just that during the eclipse, but it's only after he's given assurances that he decided to give up that most important part of himself. Griffith was promised power so great that he alone could end up fulfilling his dream without needing things like guile or great weapon proficiency. He gives up the Falcons because he's told that his dream is a part of the natural flow of time, and with that kind of power backing him, his concerns about losing quote-unquote himself end up dissolving into mist. Oftentimes, mangas will take the route of self-sacrifice in order to achieve great power or a greater understanding of the universe, but Berserk's version of it has to be the most twisted. Because Griffith doesn't die alongside the Falcons, instead, he's reborn as an evil deity with more power than he'd ever dreamed he could wield. So, to become a Godhand, you have to metaphorically burn yourself to the ground and take what defines your identity with you, and that, ladies and gentlemen, is exactly what Void did as well. In fact, we can say that he wrote the playbook that Griffith's stealing all his current place from, because Void was undoubtedly the first member of the Godhand. This is all but confirmed in chapter 362, which takes us farther back into the past of the story than we've ever been, and now that we've mentioned that chapter, it's probably a good time to talk about how Void became Void. It all started over 1,000 years before the main timeline of Berserk. At the time, the physical and astral worlds overlapped and humanity looked at spirituality in a very different way. Instead of focusing their worship on a single god like the followers of the Holy See do, they worshipped several different nature spirits that were manifestations of things like streams, strong winds, fertile grounds, and the like. Humanity was more in tune with the astral world, is basically what we're trying to say, and it was also somehow more divided than it is during Guts' lifetime because humans lived in hundreds of small and clashing tribes, clans, kingdoms, and nation-states. That age, in fact, was called the Age of the Warlords because it was a time where war was the only constant in the world. A third of the global population perished because of it, and its affiliate evils like famine and pestilence. Then, one day, a man rode out of the mists of time and unified humanity into a single collective, putting an end to nearly all the problems that plagued them. That man was Supreme King Geiserik, and he became the first, and so far the only, emperor of all mankind. Geiserik achieved the impossible by defeating every single adversary and turning a patchwork of different tribes and nations into a single tapestry with his crowned tower seated in the middle, and he got to work on integrating all these different groups into a single united polity. But as time passed, Geiserik's behavior changed, and he went from being a fierce warrior who won the world through blood and boldness to becoming a tyrant with a bloody reputation. The series has confirmed that Geiserik was the first wearer of the Berserker armor, because he's part of the current timeline as Skull Knight, and he pretty much admits to being the armor's owner before Guts. So, what we imagine happened was that the Berserker armor's negative ode ended up permeating through Geiserik's psyche on an unconscious level, and instead of fostering innovations like fire extinguishers and a working traffic system, he started indulging his vices as much as he could. It's said that he created his capital in the middle of all the nations he'd conquered and named it Midland for that reason. But because of his corruption, Geiserik drove several, shall we say, forced laborers to death while erecting this monument to his own glory. And once it was built, he bled his empire dry whilst living in obscene opulence. Midland became a den of sin, and after its perversions and affronts to the divine reached a critical point, God decided to make an example out of the Skull King and destroyed his capital city with thunder and earthquakes in a single night. All the people who lived in Midland and supported the Geiserik regime died as well, and the world was born anew. with the current kingdoms and polities rising up in place of that ancient empire. Now, this account of the downfall of Geiseric's empire actually comes from fairy tales and is partially described by the Holy See's Bible. The story claims that God sent 4 or 5 angels to Earth to pass judgment on Geiseric, and that the Sea's scripture identifies these angels as their cardinal angels. Where Void fits into all of this is in that tiny space of interpretation where the number of angels sent to Earth differs from source to source. Several local tales mention 4 angels, but other tales mention 5, and the reason for that is quite simple actually. The 5th angel was born the day that Geiseric's empire fell. And if you've been following everything we've said so far, then you might have figured out that that 5th angel is in fact Void. Berserk's mythology revolves heavily around the Godhand school of philosophy, which divides the elemental forces that compose existence into 5 broad categories. The first 4 are fire, water, earth, and air, and each of these elemental forces actually have divine/astral representatives that we've already met. The 4 elemental kings of the world are 4 silhouetted figures whom mages have called upon for eons to grant them protection against evil, especially that which rises up in the darker parts of the astral world. But you might have noticed that we only mentioned 4 of the 5 elements that Godhand philosophy focuses on, and that's because the 5th element, when translated to English, is literally called void. That word is used to denote the concept of space and nothingness, representing that which cannot be perceived through the traditional 5 senses, and when you take a look at Void's moveset, you'll realize why we're calling him the 5th elemental king. For now, let's get to the story of how he became who he is, and that information actually comes from a rather unexpected source. In chapter 138, a priest of the Holy See gives us a taste of Void's origin story, and that little morsel is enough for us to be able to flesh things out based on context. In that chapter, we're told that a long time ago, Geiseric imprisoned a detractor of his, a sage, in the Tower of Conviction because he had the gall to speak out against his regime. During his imprisonment, this sage was made to suffer through the worst torture imaginable, and he prayed for deliverance and justice to God every single day until one day his prayers were answered. An angel was made to descend from the heavens, and Geiseric was punished accordingly. What's interesting is that this chapter not only tells us how Void became a Godhand member, it also solves the mystery of the 5th angel. The Godhand members are called the 5 angels on numerous occasions throughout the series, and Void in particular is called the Archangel. The story from the Tower of Conviction refers to a single angel being the catalyst for everything, whereas other stories conflate the number to 4 or 5. What we think happened is that 4 angels appeared in the city of Midland, while the 5th was created within that tower, and this idea is sort of backed up by that flashback we mentioned a few minutes ago. So what exactly did we manage to reverse engineer from this one-page exchange about Void's backstory? A lot, actually, because the fact that he was able to become a Godhand member after enduring severe torture at Geiseric's hands means that he and Geiseric were once close. How do we think that happened? Well, the proof is in the mechanics of how a Godhand is made and what we find at the bottom of the Tower of Rebirth all the way back in chapter 53. It's in that chapter that we're given the story of the Skull King, and that story tells us that after that disastrous night, Geiseric's capital sunk beneath the earth and that the Tower of Rebirth was built to cover up the shameful past of Midland. The kingdom had sent multiple expedition teams into the abyss at the bottom of the tower, but none had ever returned, so they couldn't verify that tale. But then, right on cue, a torch falls into the same pit, and we see that it crosses from the physical world into the astral world, where we find Geiseric's sunken city broken and strewn with corpses sporting the brand of sacrifice. Like we mentioned earlier, to become a Godhand, a person has to sacrifice their dreams, an idealistic vision of themselves and the world they want to create by sacrificing several people who make that dream possible in the first place. For Griffith, it was the Band of the Falcon, which was named after him after a fashion, and it was supposed to be the instrument that would make him king. The band was so important to his plans that just the fact that he wouldn't be able to lead them again was enough to make him fall into the pits of despair. It was like he'd been killed while he was living, and that's exactly the kind of feeling that must have sparked the creation of Void. Godhand members don't just lose their loved ones and gain powers through their souls, they literally lose themselves and go from being physical, mortal beings to metaphysical concepts that congregate wherever negativity and evil gathers, so they exist solely within the astral world. To cross over to the other side, so to speak, one needs to cut off whatever's holding them to the physical world, including their most cherished ideals and dreams, because the offer that Berserk's Leviathan makes is just the best case scenario for you. If you give up once, then it will give you so much power that you'll never have to give up again, and you'll be able to achieve your dream more efficiently and effectively than you could have ever imagined. For Griffith, that dream was to use the band to become the ultimate king. For Void, it must have been creating and sustaining the greatest empire known to mankind, alongside his good friend Geiserik. That's right, folks. Void and Geiserik used to be friends. In fact, they were probably as tight as Guts and Griffith before the former learned what the latter's definition of a friend is, and we say this because otherwise, Void wouldn't have been able to do what he did to Geiserik's capital. It's clear that Void sacrificed that whole city to become the first Godhand member, and if we apply the logic we just used to explain Griffith sacrificing the Falcons here, then we see that he must have truly cared about the Empire and its supreme king quite deeply. Geiserik's Midland wasn't just a seat in the middle of all nations, it was the cultural melting pot of the ancient world. He didn't create it just to flex, he made Midland because its central location would make it the hub of his vast empire and encourage connectivity from the core. Think of King's Landing from Game of Thrones. It doesn't lie at the geographic center of Westeros, sure, but it's central enough to facilitate visits from literally every part of the continent. King's Landing has roads that lead to each of the major seats in the Seven Kingdoms, and it's located in a bay that facilitates visits from all over the world. It became the central hub of Westeros because of the Targaryens, yes, but a lot of King's Landing's prosperity also stems from its central location on the continent. Geiserik must have followed a similar ideal when he first thought of creating Midland, and that's something Void would have been on board for as well because they were good friends. However, when his buddies started exploiting his citizens instead of giving them every opportunity to prosper, Void started having doubts about Geiserik's leadership, and when things devolved into open tyranny, he started preaching against him. The Berserker armor might have won Geiserik the kingdom at a rapid pace, but the cost of using it frequently must have been quite high as well. We've seen Guts use the thing barely half a dozen times, and yet his hallucinations have become even more intense, if anything, and he's more mentally unstable and defeated than ever before. He puts on a front for his friends because he doesn't like sympathy, but he's constantly holding his inner malice at bay through immense concentration and willpower. And Guts has only had the thing for a few months at best. Geiserik used the Berserker armor presumably for years to conquer his kingdom, and the kind of effect using such an artifact for such a prolonged period of time could have on the human body is something we can't even imagine. Losing all your physical senses when you were at the peak of your physical health a few years ago is liable to make you do stupid things like trying to drink yourself blind just to taste wine, or throw increasingly depraved parties just to feel something again. When you add your best friend turning traitor to that list, it kind of makes sense why Geiserik imprisoned Void, but it doesn't justify it by any means. By his own admission, Geiserik saw himself as a foolish king centuries after his human life ended, and we're willing to bet you 3 houses and a prairie dog that he also says this because of how he treats his best friend. Deep down, he must have known that Void was right and that he was taking things too far, but by that point in time, Geiserik was too lost in the sauce to care. They built Midland side by side because, in our opinion, Void was one of the mages who came over from Elfhelm to help Geiserik win the world. You can find out more about how Geiserik is connected to Elfhelm by checking out our many videos on him and the Skull Knight, but as it relates to this video, what's most important is that he and Void were quite close. Void cared about building this empire of man, probably just as much as Geiserik did, so when he was imprisoned and tortured, and not one of the people he'd worked tirelessly to bring together came forward for him, he got disillusioned with the world. To make matters worse, his supposed friend tortured him so badly that his eyes and mouth were sewn shut and the flesh was peeled off of his face, and yet he continued to pray to God to show him the way. Void's current appearance makes total sense if you think that he kept the face that he had the moment he became a Godhand member. Griffith does something similar by making his torture mask a part of his natural face as Femto, because it's the torture and the humiliation of wearing a device that mocks his standard warhelm that pushes him over the edge. He carries that last human humiliation and pain of his to the other side, and makes it a part of his identity going forward, and that's what we think Void did too. It would explain why he looks like a hot mess, whereas the other Godhand members' appearances border on creepy and beautiful. Except Slan, of course. She's just beautiful, and our toxic trait is ignoring the fact that she inspires death sex cults. As a human, Void tried to find deliverance by praying to and invoking numerous spirits, most likely, because we think he was a mage. Sage is a term that's closely associated with spiritual leaders, and in Eastern mythology and philosophy, a sage can commune with spirits if they're dedicated enough to their craft. Miura used that to base his magical invocations on, because the spirits in Berserk only help you if you commune and become one with them. As a sage living in a world where magic was commonplace, place, Void would have known various magical rituals, especially if he came from Elfhelm. But the thing is, none of those invocations helped him when it came to being freed from the Tower of Conviction. He was left utterly alone in that place, and that's what the overarching antagonist of this series, the idea of evil, decided to take advantage of. The idea of evil is the astral embodiment of the very concept of evil, and in the deleted chapter, 83, it tells us that it was born because humans needed reasons to make their lives feel less directionless and filled with misery. The idea created the Behelits and programmed them to respond to their target's deep despair, so it makes sense that Void's loneliness and sense of abandonment and desire for vengeance and bringing true change to the world brought it to the Tower of Conviction that fateful night. The idea saw that the many injustices that the world had thrust upon this man, who wanted nothing but for it to prosper, had primed him in a way that no human being had ever been primed before, and so it made him an offer. If he gave up his current dream of keeping Geiseric's quote-unquote utopia intact, it would give him the chance to create a true utopia in the future, and to sweeten the deal, Void would now have way more power than Geiseric ever did to do whatever the hell he wants. Spurred on by betrayal and a deep desire to bring his vision of a unified mankind to life, Void accepted the idea of evil's deal, and the rest, as they say, is history. Soon after he made that decision, Void was told that he could choose any form he wanted for the task that was ahead of him, and he chose to retain the tortured face that led him to his salvation. To Void, the moment he came into contact with the idea must have been like a divine revelation, and the best way he could have thought to honor it was to keep the appearance he had when he met it for the rest of his new life. He unleashed some proto-apostles at Geiseric, who was trying to save his lover marked with the brand of sacrifice, while his capital was pulled into the astral world by countless bone-like tendrils. And as he came face to face with Void for the first time chronologically in that flashback from chapter 362, we saw that the abyss/the vortex of souls/hell itself was swirling in the background. Void sacrificed the city that was a manifestation of his most cherished ideals and dreams, which of course included its king and queen. Geiseric's lover died in his arms thanks to whatever nightmare descended upon Midland that fateful night, and it's implied that he himself bears a brand of sacrifice. When Guts first puts on the Berserker armor, Skull Knight is present to witness it, and so is Nosferatu Zod, his longtime rival. When Zod notices the armor on Guts, he smirks to himself and asks Skull Knight if he wants the kid to take the same road to hell that he's on. As far as we know, the Berserker armor doesn't send people's souls to hell, it just kind of preys on them until it consumes them. So the fact that Zod says that must mean that Skull Knight was stamped with a brand of sacrifice, and that his current existence as a vengeful wraith is thanks in part to the brand, as well as whatever magic Hanar did to transfer his soul from the Berserker armor to his current Skull Knight armor. After cursing all the people that defined his ideal vision for human unity, Void enters the karmic cycle and breaks the astral world away from the physical world. He withdraws to the depths of the astral world and starts preparing for the day when all of existence can be unified into a single cohesive unit, regardless of whether said unit is screaming in agony or not for eternity. And now that we've brought up the Vortex of Souls, let's move on to explain exactly what Void's plan is. His goal is to make the world evil, why Void isn't interfering in Griffith's plans. The fact that Void is the first ever Godhand member is indisputable, mainly because of one thing. He's the only one that can perform the Invocation of Doom. The Invocation of Doom is perhaps the most important part of any demonic ritual because it's the part that certifies a sacrificial offering is worthy by searing the brand of sacrifice into their flesh. This invocation basically confirms that the target of a demonic ritual has agreed to align themselves with the Godhand's ideology. And although it isn't spoken of enough in an overt fashion, the Godhand's ideology is still quite simple. Spread as much evil as is possible throughout the human world until nothing but evil remains. That's why Griffith's ascension also marks the beginning of the Age of Darkness, because he's the last piece that's needed to complete the puzzle of evil. When Void became the archangel of all demonkind, he also became an elemental king who can manipulate the very concept of space. We saw him opening a portal to deflect Skull Knight's sword back at his own shield in chapter 88, so we know that spatial control is Void's core power as a Godhand member. This would also explain how he was able to sever the astral worlds overlapping with the physical world, because to perform such a feat, an immense amount of spatial magic would be required. Once Void created the separation, he was able to control the flow of the kind of astral beings that could show up in the physical world, because he was most likely integral in creating the very concept of apostles. Apostles didn't exist before the first eclipse, but in the current timeline of Berserk, we've seen literally hundreds of them who come from various centuries. As the number of apostles increases, the number of good spirits in the world decreased, and magic and spiritual communion started being viewed as heretical. This perspective was spread primarily through the Holy See, and it makes sense when you consider the fact that Void himself went from being a spiritual sage to a demonic angel pledged in service to a single god. Many mages don't even know that the idea of evil exists because they've never dared to dive that deep into the layers of the Astral World. Flora, one of the most knowledgeable characters in the series, has no clue about the fact that the Godhand's benefactor is literally the concept of evil. She knows this because, like most mages, whether they're ancient or from the current timeline, traversing the path that leads to the deepest layers of the Astral World is one of the most difficult things to do. There's a lot of risk involved because one misstep could leave you stuck in there forever. And right now, that's pretty much what everyone assumes happened to Shirkei. She entered the Dragon Path about 10 chapters before chapter 383, and she hasn't woken up, even though several days have passed. And as for how the Holy See was involved, well, all you have to do is take a look at the way Mozgus treats people, whether they're devoted to his religion or heretics/infidels. After helping a mother save her dying baby by breaking protocol and taking them to see the physician at the Tower of Conviction, Mozgus has the mother, quote-unquote, repent for her sins because she admitted to stealing food for her baby, which is a crime in the eyes of the church. Moreover, from Mozgus's perspective, the baby would have died and become a part of God's court, but because the mother saved it from that divine fate, she needed to take his place. The Holy See also erected churches on grounds that were formerly the dwellings of nature spirits all across its sphere of influence, which tells us that they were trying to actively suppress good magic in this world, and they were using religion as an excuse to spread misery. Misery is an important word here, because the Godhand's influence is most keenly felt among large congregations of humans that are utterly dissatisfied with their own lives. The greatest example of this comes from the Conviction arc, where a heretical cult rose up on the outskirts of a holy city because the Holy See was trampling all their freedoms. Not just the perverse kind, but civil liberties as well. And this cult worshipped a flame goddess who was, for all intents and purposes, Slan herself. So this pretty much confirms that the Godhand is removing the influence of positive magic from the world while spreading its own malign ideology. And if you ask us, based on everything we've read, this strategy was most likely Void's idea. As a former King's aide, he would have known exactly how to manipulate society and religion to his own advantage, because Geiseric would have done a similar thing when he became Emperor of Mankind. But why are he and his group of all-powerful demon kings so obsessed with pushing people towards a particular direction where evil is the only thing that exists or even matters anymore? Well, surprisingly enough, the answer is given to us by Griffith, and that answer is to turn all living beings into quote-unquote one. In chapter 195, one of Griffith's latest recruits, a young lord called Mule Wolfflame, experiences firsthand just how hypnotic a Godhand's presence can be. Mule is a sharp and determined nobleman, and he was willing to lay his life down to protect his subjects. The reborn Band of the Falcon appearing and liberating his besieged city was a miracle, but that didn't convince Mule to join them. In fact, he was hesitant about it until he met Griffith, which is when he was overcome with this weird sense of devotion to him, despite having met him for the first time just recently. Mule also questioned Griffith about the soul ceremonies that have become a staple of his court these days, and the answer he got was rather creepy. See, souls in Berserk take on the form of these wispy little white balls, and usually, when they're released from their physical shells, they head to destinations based on their karma in life. That's what happens to the souls of the Kushan slaves that Shirkei encounters in Britannis, and Shirkei is a mage who's properly trained in the art of positive/good magic. Griffith, however, tells Mule that the souls he draws out of the people who have died in his service are all heading to a place where they become one. This place can only be the abyss where the vortex of souls resides, because that vortex is described as a swirling mass of every damned spirit that has become a combined entity condemned to live in torture forever. This is odd, considering the fact that Griffith's goal is to become king of all there is and all there ever will be. He wants to become the most recognizable figure in history, and that means that he needs a lot of subjects, and that those subjects need to spread his gospel all across planet Earth. That process would be a lot simpler if there wasn't the risk of people finding out that you're sending the souls of those who serve under you straight to hell, but that risk is present for Griffith. All it takes is for one trained and skilled mage to track the trajectory of the souls he liberates, and they should be able to figure out his deception quite easily. So why is Griffith risking being exposed when he knows that Guts has a more than capable mage on his team, and he knows that Guts won't stop coming for his head? Well, the only reason we can think of is that Griffith isn't the one who made this call. It was an executive decision handed down to him by Void. Being the de facto leader of the Godhand, Void does hold more authority over his fellow kinsmen than they like to let on. For instance, during the eclipse, Void is the clear ringleader, and he can even see things that the other Godhand members can't, like the fact that Guts and Casca were destined to survive the eclipse. All Godhand members can interpret the meaning of causality to a certain extent, but Void's perception of the concept seems to be crystal clear. He cancelled the Slug Count's second apostle ritual before he even rejected the Godhand's offer, because Void knew that the Count had chosen his daughter over himself instinctively. And if you factor in the idea that he shared Geiseric's dream of uniting mankind under a single banner, then the big picture starts to emerge in rather terrifying fashion. Where Geiseric tried to bring people together the traditional way and didn't attempt to strip them of all that made them human, Void, through his transformation, came to see that that was folly. The only way humanity can be truly unified is if they're forced to become part of a single entity. And because the idea of evil claims that it's a spawn of humans themselves, he decided that the Abyss is the place that would help him realize his dream. This is why Void does what he does and is who he is, and this purpose of his doesn't explicitly interfere with Griffith's desire to become king, so he never bothers to interfere with his campaign the same way that Slan and Conrad and Ubik do. For Void, as long as the souls keep coming, his plan is working, because all he wants is for humanity to be united. The fact that this unity would also mean that all humans spend the rest of eternity in torment is a moot point to him, because he himself attained quote-unquote enlightenment after being tortured to within a millimeter of his life. Ironically enough, this goal of his isn't quite different from his artistic inspirations, because the Cenobites too wanted to grab as many humans for hell as they could. The only difference here is Void hasn't been brainwashed like them, and so all his choices are intentional, which just makes them even more terrifying. But as for who he is, why he looks the way he looks, and what his true purpose is with regards to Berserk's story, we hope we've answered those questions at length throughout this video, because marvelous verdict! That's all we got for you guys. Let us know what you think about Void's origins and true purpose down in the comments section below, because we know you guys will have thoughts about what we've said here, and we can't wait to hear them. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Marvelous Anime for more Berserk content, and we'll see you guys real soon with another deep dive into manga's darkest world. Until then, stay safe, and don't forget, keep on struggling, fellow strugglers.